Well, today I am with Coach Linda Blade, and I'm super excited to talk to you about your new book. I have the title here, Unsporting: How Trans Activism and Science Denial are Destroying Sports. Yay! Oh my God,
Yay.
Linda, I am
I
so
finally got my hard copy.
that's amazing.
Yeah,
I am so excited that this is out there. And do you want to just tell us about it? Give us an overview.
sure. Thank you, first of all, Erin, for having me. It's also an honor for me. You've been such a warrior in this whole endeavor, and we're facing a kind of madness, aren't we? So I have to say that I would never have thought I'd write a book like this. I graduated with my PhD in the 90s, and it was in the area of human biology and kinesiology, specifically on aspects of sexual dimorphism of growing children in sports.
I didn't realize
And
that. So
yeah,
you really
so
were steeped in, the foundations of this. You're really the
yeah,
perfect person to write this book.
well, I can't believe how all aspects of my life sort of came together because, I grew up in South America playing soccer in the streets with the little boys. I was such a tomboy. So I can kind of see that gender nonconforming was a thing from ages past, long before me. And so I was very fortunate to go through the NCAA system. I had a scholarship, Title IX, and University of Maryland team captain on the track team. And so I was so grateful to the people who worked hard to get Title IX in place, and to the United States as a country, because there was no opportunities anywhere else. And so I was grateful for that competition experience, and it really defined me in many ways. And then going into the 90s and working with a lot of databases showing growing boys and girls and how their bodies are changing, and how that impacts your human function, whether that's in sport or any other way. And then I didn't get a professorship as I thought I would, because I married an agriculture scientist. He wanted to work in Africa, and I enjoyed many years on and off with the UN assignments in Africa. And so I'd work with athletes in Africa and teaching coaches to be like at the university in northern Nigeria, where it's the Islamic area. So I got this sort of global experience in terms of even women in the Islamic cultures. Came back, and when we came back to Canada, there were no professorships to be had, in the sense, at that moment, in this province of Alberta where I live. So I just started doing sport performance consulting independently, just as a consulting business, and it turned out to be very, very down my alley. Very, not necessarily lucrative. It's just that it was such a rich environment, almost like a living lab. Like, I could not have had, if I had been a professor in a lab with a lab of my own, I would never have been exposed to this many athletes, these different types of performance aspects, being able to watch people in real life all the time functioning, getting insights. And of course, when I had my children, it enabled me to just be able to control my life. I wasn't going to book a client when my children were coming home from school. I had total freedom to do what I could do, right? And coach and learn. And so I was just in this world. I was just in coaching sports. And then I became president of Athletics Alberta. I ran into this gender ideology because the government, various bureaucracies within Canadian sport, I should say, not the government per se, but in some ways the government takes credit, it takes responsibility. But all of a sudden in 2018, I ran into this buzzsaw of gender ideology and people pushing self-identification into women's sports. And I thought, that's just not going to work. And I have to protect my duty, actually, as president of a sports association, is to protect my athletes and to make sure that we have an environment where the rules are clear so that nobody feels unsafe in terms of even an official making a judgment call. So, what really alarmed me was when I kind of pushed back a little bit at the first meeting, and all the other people around the table were sort of like, it's one of those awkward situations where nobody really wants to say anything and they're looking down at their hands. And I thought, oh, well, we're in big trouble here. So fast forward to 2020, I was able to publish an article about my thoughts in the Post Millennial, and Barbara Kay was helping me, one of the Canadian journalists who's highly regarded. And that was that. It was published in, I think, February of 2020. And then all of a sudden last year, exactly a year ago this month, I got a call or an email from Barbara saying, would you be willing to write a book on this topic? And it kind of floored me because I hadn't considered it. I really hadn't.
Oh, wow.
And so that's how it all got started, Erin. I'm sorry for the long backstory,
No,
but it really all leads up to a moment where everything I've experienced in sport and in academia and in my business and in real life and in leadership all kind of collided into this one moment where I have a chance, once and for all, instead of yapping away on Twitter, once and for all, doing something where I can just set it in stone kind of thing and paper and put it out into the world and say, this is what I think at this point in time. In this point in time, we need somebody to stand up and say, this is what is happening. And because I think a lot of the people around me, they kind of know vaguely what's going on, but they don't realize the depth and the breadth of what's actually happening. And before it becomes absolutely a catastrophe, I felt like it was worth saying something quite quickly.
Well, and I think it's critical. One of the things that I keep thinking is that the younger women and girls who are in athletics now have no sense of what it was like before Title IX.
Right.
And so for them, they're kind of confused about what's the big deal. Can you describe what the state of sports were like before Title IX for women, or if did it even exist?
Well, it definitely that women couldn't get scholarships. So for sure, like if you were, I'm really proud to say this, Erin, that my grandmother, who grew up as, she was a part Native woman, but it was in Iowa on a farm. And she, in the around like late 1920s, she was very famous in her village in Spirit Lake for being a pole vaulter. Like,
oh, wow.
People had never seen a girl who could vault. Like she said, it was with a bamboo pole. And she said that she was really good at it. She could compete with the guys. And I thought, wow, like that was, that was quite a few years. That was like 70 years before it was actually internationally, permitted for women to pole vault. So, so you take somebody like my grandmother, and she was a great athlete, clearly. But that was it. She had a little sort of fling in high school, did a few little vaults over a pole, over a bar. And then her life went on. There was no opportunities. She went back carrying water up and down that hill. I mean, even when I was in university, I visited her on the farm. She was still pumping water out of the well and carrying the buckets up the hill. Like the women and girls across America and across the world, really. I mean, we just basically, if we wanted to do sports, probably a few opportunities here and there in high school, and little teams, or maybe a community game or something, but very few went on to do anything. And in university, it was mostly just, a club or like, a recreational group.
Well, and I think something about your grandmother that's so important for people to understand is that, for affluent women who wanted to participate in sports, there were some opportunities. They could go to the club and play, or they could go to, be on a college team, perhaps. I'm not sure when women started participating in the Olympics, but if you could afford to pay for training and facilities and the time it takes to be involved in sports. There were some ways in which women could be involved, but for women who were on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum,
Nothing.
there was nothing.
Nothing.
And opportunities that are afforded to athletes through scholarships, through going to college, getting an education, through sponsorships is huge. And I wonder if you could talk about how those will be impacted if men are allowed to participate as women.
Well, at the moment, there's, the people who are pushing back against us, the trans activists, are saying, well, there's not that many, it's not going to have a big impact. Male bodies, and they're talking about male bodies in women's sports, of course, self-identification into women's sports. But I mean, the thing is, if you take Laurel Hubbard as an example, if you take that person and put them on the top podium, only one, it means every single woman in that competition was bumped down one notch, like going down, like a domino.
Can you explain who Laurel Hubbard is for people?
Laurel Hubbard is a New Zealand weightlifter, heavyweight, that transitioned, was a male, even had a junior national record or title in New Zealand, was the son of a very wealthy millionaire man who eventually became even the mayor of Auckland, I believe. And anyway, so in his 30s, he transitioned and took up weightlifting against women. And so it kind of, the iconic picture and photo that you will see if you Google Laurel Hubbard is a picture of a very big man standing on the number one spot on the podium with two large Samoan, because this is heavyweight, weightlifting. So you have the Samoan women who were on the side of him, who were very good weightlifters as well. And the one who got second, Feagaga Stowers, she actually came into sports and weightlifting because of having suffered terrible sexual abuse as a child. She was actually in a foster home or a care home. And she actually brought herself out of the state of complete oppression, in a sense, through sport and weightlifting, became national hero in Samoa. And this was the games, like the Pacific Games of all of the Pacific region, all those countries came to Samoa. It was at home for these great Pacific Games. And she actually carried the flag in the stadium because everyone was sure she was going to have the gold medal. Wow. And imagine the devastation that this man comes along, male body, self-identifying as a woman, Laurel Hubbard, beats her, lifts more weight than her, and he gets to stand on the number one spot. A wealthy son, white, middle-aged man, gets to get the gold medal, takes away her glory, and she has to stand there. And if she would have said anything, like if she had raised a fist or anything, she would have been disciplined by the sports world. So you'll see a photo of her where she's just standing there with her head down. Like it breaks your heart. And it's just like one instance like that is too many.
Well, and that's so one of the things that is so confounding to me is I was actually listening to some of the hearings about the Equality Act here in the US, which would allow self-ID into women's sports if passed. And I kept hearing legislator and leader after leader saying, well, it won't be that big a deal. It might only be one or two. We shouldn't get our, knickers in a wad over this.
Yeah.
Going to be, a couple of men who take spots away from women. And as you point out, one is too many. Like that logic to me is so confusing. Can you imagine in any other situation where we would allow somebody who, basically is acting like a bully to appropriate somebody else's title and celebrate it? I mean, it's just heartbreaking.
Well, I have a graph in chapter 9. I have my book was delayed, Erin, because I needed to put in a chapter 12, called, I don't know if you can see it, but it's called Biden Skews Title 9. You can't see it. So in that chapter, in that chapter, I have the results of a study that was done in California, a researcher who basically was statistical with his PhD. And he did a thing where, given the current percentage, 2% of trans in the population, what would be the probability? So if you just run the numbers, what would be the probability of, with only 2, given the advantage males have over females, and given the current rate in the population, what would be the chance, the probability of a male to female transgender athlete dominating in any given sport or event? So he goes right down the list, and the highest one, well, there, let's say 100 meters, 93.9% probability that that event would be dominated by a male.
Wow.
Given the current, like in any high school, given any
That's how it is
situation.
now.
Not right now. So
Right
93.9% probability that the 100 meters would be dominated by male athletes in the high schools or colleges. 97% probability in the 400 meters. And this is the probability of anywhere you go in the United States, that if there's a trans person who just decides that they're going to self-identify into a female sport. The problem is we don't know whether they do.
Clarify for people is that these are not necessarily people who have even suffered from gender dysphoria. You know, we talk about,
they're just self-identifying.
Trans people, but you know, trans is such a, you know, to me it's such a difficult word to pin down because of so many things. And so when I talk about it, I try to say, you know, this person had gender dysphoria and transitioned as a treatment. It's not an identity. It's actually a treatment. But in this case, it's self-ID. So any man, regardless of their history, regardless of feelings, can say, I'm feeling like a woman today. I'm going to compete in women's sports.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in Canada, the way the law they were pushing to us is that a male who comes to a sport and says, I feel like I'm a woman this semester for this sport, they can do that, and they can flip back to being in a men's sport in another sport or something. They can flip back and forth completely at will, with no surgery, no hormonal intervention. And guess what, Erin? The Canadian equivalent of the NCAA completely accepted that policy. They've instantiated already.
I don't have a history like you do in sports, and I am just appalled. I cannot figure it out. I can't imagine how you're like describe.
Oh, I can't. I don't even know what to say, because I feel like I've suddenly been plunged into a parallel universe where all the parameters of life that I've gone by in my realm of sport no longer apply somehow magically. And yet we're supposed to, on our end, maintain certain boundaries and categories so that they can transition into it. So the one side has to hold firm, because guess what would happen if we erased all our boundaries? They couldn't identify into anything.
Right.
So
interesting. Right.
So on the one hand, we're supposed to be keeping all of these categories distinct, but allow them to hop around any way they want.
Right.
So it's not even equivalent in terms of any kind of treatment of the logic. If we're going to take them out their logic, then just eliminate men's and women's sports completely and go back to the way it used to be, because that's really what you're saying. That's really what you're saying, but you're trying to hide it behind this cloak of, oh, it's just that women will be very accepting of these people. And you know what? 50%, apparently, it seems like, of the feminists really completely buy into this.
It's so confusing to me. And again, I think part of that is the younger women, they have no concept of how hard Title IX was to get. One of the other things that I want to ask you, and I assume this is true in Canada and a lot of other places, and will be potentially true in the US, if we allow self-IDing into women's sports, that also means self-IDing into women's locker rooms and showers. Is that correct?
And prisons, which is happening. Right. I mean, this goes way beyond sports. You know, like I keep talking about what a tragedy it is for sports, but what a tragedy it would be if I was the victim of rape and I'm now in a shelter and now I'm seeking shelter. Like shelter means shelter. It means wanting to find safety. And then some person who is a perpetrator and a predator can simply identify in there with me. Like, what in the world? I mean, honestly, like, sport, it has a certain importance in life, but there are things far beyond sports that are far more important to the to society at large even. I mean, sport is probably, it's sort of emblematic. And that's why people say it's good that I wrote this book, because it is emblematic, but it's not even the most important thing. And there's more things happening that are worse. And especially when we get to the children's issue, and I mean,
it's
that's
so
so
global
much
too. I mean, it has its feelers into everything. So one of the things that I don't even know how to respond to this, because to me it's sort of like somebody asking, or saying there's no such thing as night and day, or there's no such thing as the planet Earth, or there's no such thing as the sun. I keep having activists say to me, I don't know why you're talking about this biology thing. There's really no
yeah.
such thing as a biological male and female. If a man feels like he's a woman, then his penis is a biologically female penis. I mean, I've heard this kind of statement where they're fundamentally denying the biological differences of male and female. You have great experience in that. Can you talk about just, how do we know somebody's a woman other than her external genitalia?
Well, okay. I listened to your sentence. I mean,
I know you're like,
listen.
sometimes
Okay, but it's not you saying, obviously you're repeating what people say, but again, going back to my premise that they expect those of us in society who are still sane to keep our standards. So the very fact that somebody would say, I don't recognize biological sex, but by the way, my penis is a female. Like, you've just invoked biological sex to talk about your genitalia when you're saying it doesn't exist. So make up your mind, because that's the thing that I don't get about this. They feel it's their right to do away with all definitions, but we must be compelled to keep our definitions so they can stomp all over them. So I guess what I'm saying is, getting back to the sport issue, biology matters, and believe me, it's not only genitalia. If they think it's only about genitalia, it is not, because there are 6,000 variables, Aaron, like whether you're talking about the tiny nano machines inside the cells, whether you're talking about blood volume, whether you're talking about lung volume and capacity, whether you're talking about muscle strength, whether you're talking about your skeleton, how the angles of the joints are made. Like, there are so many variables. Each one in and of itself might have overlaps with males, like height, whatever. But when we say sexual dimorphism, think about that word, dimorphism. Morphology is in the middle of that. Morphology means design. So basically, you see, houses that are different designs, or automobiles are different designs, and the human beings also have distinct designs. So to say that just because, like what McKinnon Ivey, one of the famous trans athletes, tries to say, well, because there's overlap in height, men and women overlap in height. I mean, that's like saying the tire size overlaps with another car, so it's the same design. No, it's not. They're completely distinct designs. And when you compete with one design with the same design.
Right.
So
you wouldn't have a NASCAR racing against
a Formula One.
Right. Because they're different.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it doesn't even matter if they win or lose, really. It's just inappropriate, because what would it mean if a Formula One car would suddenly be thrown into a NASCAR race and that car wins or loses, or second, third place? What's the meaning of that car being in there? Because
what you're trying categories. There's no.
What's the meaning of that category if you're going to throw in like, guys would go nuts. And the difference between, like, anybody who's a NASCAR fan would just go nuts to see a Formula One car thrown into that race, because it's not the category. And so it wouldn't even matter if that car won or got dead last. It's completely inappropriate to have the car on that track at that time, because you're competing in NASCAR race. So when I get, and I've had some biologists push back and say, yeah, that's a nice, convenient analogy, but human beings are so close together in form that it's hard to make that distinction. Well, not really, because the number of variables that differ in a NASCAR versus a Formula One are actually much fewer than the number of variables that differ between males and females. It's just that we're used to seeing ourselves as human beings and as a whole person and all that. And it's hard maybe, but I don't find it hard to distinguish between a male and a female. Anybody if I took any child and went to the mall and started pointing to somebody and say, is that a man or a woman? Is that a man or a woman? Is that a man or a woman? Pretty clear, yeah. Right? I mean, 99% of the time, it is really clear.
The other thing is that the medications, though, because our bodies physiologically respond differently to medications.
Yeah, absolutely.
Medical interventions, all kinds of things, the way our fat's distributed. It's not just sort of these, genitalia or chromosomes, of course, are like designed for us. But, I even think it's different. I would say that our differences are more like having a bicycle against a Formula One. I mean, they're just,
that's exactly right. Huge difference. If you add it all up, huge difference. And so, their argument that, well, for example, with Chelsea Mitchell, people are saying, well, Chelsea shouldn't complain. This is one of the girls from Connecticut. She shouldn't complain because she actually beat Terry Miller or Andre, one of the two, in a race. So clearly she's able to win. So what are you complaining about? It's not even about winning or losing in that sense. Losing to a male is really devastating, like psychologically, but whether he won or not doesn't make any difference. He shouldn't be in that race. And secondly, what they fail to point out is the only reason she won that race was because he false started and he had to step out of the race.
Interesting. And so to me, again, it's about those categories. If we were to start having high school students compete against junior high students, or even adults competing in junior high sports. Yeah. If we started having, the weight categories, I can identify as someone who's 120 pounds rather than 150 pounds in order to compete against people who are smaller than me. I mean, there are all different. Right. I mean, if we're going to break down these categories, basically, we don't even need to have sports anymore because.
Well, it's not sports. Where does it end? Because then if you can do that, if you can self-identify across a categorical boundary, then what about the boundaries of placing? So I could actually jog around and say, okay, I identify as first place.
Yes. I feel like the winner, and you need to honor those feelings. Otherwise, I think suicide.
Like if you don't give me the gold medal, my gosh, you don't know what I'm going to do to myself. Yeah. I mean, it's just utterly preposterous. There isn't sport if we can't keep these boundaries. I mean, that's the whole point. You set a boundary and you compete within that boundary.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. I talked to somebody recently who said that he felt it was unreasonable for women today to have to compete in male and female sports because the feminists were the ones who came up with those categories, and they're pretty meaningless now. And I was like, what? I mean,
no.
I was shocked. No. I was shocked. And so again,
they're such liars.
It's these arguments that are being used that are so absurd that it's almost hard to even argue against them, because where do you start with an argument like that? I mean,
well, at some point you can't argue anymore. You just have to hope that the leadership in sports is sane and, cares about, safety. And because the hierarchy in sport should still be, once you set into place the boundaries, then the hierarchy of needs to include athletes will be safety first, fairness, lastly, way down the line, inclusion. And as I point out, inclusion should first go to the athletes who belong in that category, obviously, because we hear in sport is a realm where you hear no a lot, like, you didn't make the team. No, you didn't win the race. No, you don't get to go on that trip, on and on and on. So if suddenly we're going to make it more inclusive, then we need to broaden it for even more women to get in, not more men. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, and for like I said in a different podcast yesterday, you know, it's pretty clear when we offer a third category, for example, or some other really workable alternative, the activists don't want it. They need to be a male. The male needs to be seen as a woman by running in the women's race. So they insist on coming into the female category. So I always make the point, that's a form, you're using sport as a form of social therapy. And that's not what sport should be used for. And I dare say it is the last place where you would send somebody for psychological social therapy in a way, because you do hear the word no a lot. The only person who hears a yes is the winner or is the person who makes the team. So it's an environment where there's winning and there's losing, there's clear-cut standards, there's clear-cut results. And if you can't handle no, as far as coming into the category or not, you don't belong in sport, because in sport, we all get used to hearing no. And why is that person exempt from hearing the word no?
That's such a good point. That's such a, I mean, I had not thought of that before, but I mean, yeah, you need to, I actually always stayed away from competitive sports because I'm not a competitive person, because I like to be, collaborative and stuff. So that makes a lot of sense. And the other thing, as you were talking, it strikes me as fundamentally at the root of all this is undermining women's consent.
Right.
At the very heart of all of this, women are being told, it doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what you feel. It doesn't matter what's fair. We're going to allow men to have their feelings be privileged over your rights and protections.
Yeah. This is where, if I feel like putting my fist through a wall, that's really what it is. It's the disrespect. Yeah. It's the disrespect for our safety, for our integrity, for our dignity as people. I just feel like, even for example, the International Olympic Committee, when they came with a new regulation in 2015, allowing males to self-identify into women's sports, it was without a hint of concern for the female athletes at large. It took one trans activist to be on their medical committee, and who was a runner, who had a little bit of data from 8 athletes that wasn't even, it was just bullshit data, self-declared running times from before and after. And, N equals 8.
Science really doesn't matter anymore. And that's actually part of your book, is the whole science denial aspect of this.
Mm-hmm. And sort of we woven and in between all the lines is this sense that they needed women as a platform and a category to get rid of a men's problem. And so we were the convenient dumping ground for something they didn't want to deal with. And they did it without a hint of a thought about what that would do to every single woman in the world. Because if the Olympic Committee says it's going to be like this, guess what happens? Every national sports governing body takes the hint from them, takes the precedent from them. And then the national sport governing bodies, like what I ran into in Canada, now start pushing it on the provinces and the states and the communities.
And it trickles down into our elementary schools. I mean,
all the way through. And so I really lay this blame at the feet of the International Olympic Committee, because if they hadn't done that, we could easily fight this, even if this was coming at the national level. But the IOC had held their ground and said, no. We know what a woman is. We know what a man is. We could all appeal to the IOC and say, look, what are you talking about? They're not doing that. Why should we do that? Because they did it. We all have to do it. Except when you get down to the state level, which is what I love about what's going on right now. Because I'm the Alberta is a province in Canada, very much like a state in the United States. And I run with my board, like I'm elected as president. I'm not an autocrat. My board and I can decide what the rules are at ground level within this categorical aspect, based on our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the provision that you do not discriminate on the basis of sex. That still exists in Canada as well. They seem to be ignoring that. So I can lay claim to my rights as a citizen in Canada to to reinforce sex-based boundaries, as my charter allows me to do. And even if they say they passed this legislation in 2016 saying that it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of gender identity and gender expression, which is fine. We're not discriminating.
Yeah, if a man wants to wear a one piece or a bikini when he swims,
But it's not, we're being expected to interpret it a certain way. But meanwhile, they have completely taken their eye off the ball of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms about sex-based boundaries. So there's a clash of rights here. And at the state level and provincial levels, we are pushing back and saying, sorry, this far and no further, because we're the ones, like, think about sports, Erin. The beauty of sports in a way is that it does only happen at ground level. So my national governing body can make some rule or regulation about the competition outcome or how you measure something. But when it comes to actually running a competition, it's our people, our officials. It only happens on the ground. It's not going to happen in some bureaucracy, right? Sport happens on the ground. And the IOC benefits. So it's basically, we're almost like the athlete factory, and we have, like, almost like we go back to the race car. We take in these little sort of raw materials, children, and we just totally work with them through the, in this factory, which is the states, inside the provinces, inside the high schools and the clubs and all this. And then what you have in sport, which is kind of weird, and we let this happen, at least in the United States, that goes through the NCAA, but in Canada, it's just basically the officials of the government and the IOC. They're standing there with their fingers crossed, hoping that the exit door of the factory comes this Ferrari that they can then use to make all their money in international sports, right? So we're the athlete, we're where it happens on the ground. And one of the reasons for writing this book is for the moms, the dads, the officials on the ground, where they understand what's going on. Because I am now convinced, because this ideology is so pervasive internationally and it's covered everything, the resistance to it can only happen from the ground up again. Yeah, the people on the ground can simply say,
it's going to be
the people on the ground
who are incensed that their daughter has to share a shower with a biological male. I mean,
right.
That's what it's going to be.
So what's the IOC going to do, or even our national federations? They kill the sport. Nobody shows up anymore. You've completely killed the meaning. You've killed the joy, and nobody does it anymore. What's the point in their existence? They're actually legislating themselves out of their own existence by killing us. It's like parchment, like it's like drying out the roots and expecting the plant to live.
Yeah.
You're killing us.
It's ironic too that the IOC is doing this, because I think one of my first memories about the Olympics, and I can't remember how old I was or if it was some news story I saw, but it was about the suspicion that there were female athletes who were pumping up on testosterone.
And that was Eastern Bloc, for sure.
Yeah, and
that was my era. I saw it with my own eyes.
And I remember people were enraged. And I remember, Saturday Night Live used to do these skits about it because it was so
with the arm coming off and blood. Yeah.
Absurd. And everybody recognized it as completely unfair, that they were doing something that was completely unsportsmanlike, and that I believe they were stripped of their medals. I'm not sure what ultimately happened.
Some were.
But there was definitely an awareness that this was cheating. Now, if it's cheating for a female body to inject testosterone, how on earth is it okay for a male body to pretend to be female? I mean,
this is what I keep saying. So we have, the data kind of shows more or less that if it shows that more or less 9%, 10% of an improvement, if you dope, there's a 9 or 10% improvement. Okay. Let's go back to the weightlifting with Laurel Hubbard. He has up to 50% advantage. So 2 to 3 times as much advantage as somebody doping.
Wow.
right? So the Olympic officials say what their position is right now is doping equals bad, 10%. 50% male and women's sports is, oh, great.
They're being brave
So,
and authentic.
and in Canada, so if I don't know if you remember the big race showdowns between Ben Johnson and Carl Lewis. But Carl Lewis, well, anyway, in the 1988 Olympics, there was this American athlete, Carl Lewis, he's still coaching, I think in Houston, and a Canadian athlete named Ben Johnson. And they had this big class. They were the top runners in the world. And the Canadian guy was caught doping. So that was a huge controversy in Canada. It was Canadian national disgrace, blah, 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 because he won in the 88 Olympics and then they had to strip him of his medal. So about 10 years after that, there was various permutations of sort of anti-doping, keep Canada sport clean. There was this huge movement to make sure that this never happens to us.
Ironic.
that disgrace. Well, and here, this is only the beginning of the irony. So what ended up happening, there was this center that was developed, which is our basic anti-cheating bureaucracy, called the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports, CCES. It's the CCES that is pushing the sports organizations to have male bodies in women's sports. So the very organization that when I was an athlete, and as soon as I retired, and they were set up so that Canadians would never be disgraced in sport again by cheating, they are the ones pushing male bodies in female sports. So this is why, and that's what I brought up in this book. And then, of course, because they're so influential, the only organization in Canada that gets public dollars to support and preserve and protect and promote women's sports, Canadian Women in Sport, they are right on board with the CCES. And in fact, the CCES, I had this experience in the room. We're having our AGM as a track and field group for national track and field. And they send in one of these women from the Canadian Women in Sports organization to tell us about the genderbread person.
Oh my gosh. I'm sorry. For people who don't know the genderbread person, do you want to describe a little bit? I mean,
yeah, it's this little.
Did everybody
like
jaw drop?
I mean, some stupid unicorn type person that has, like that they use it to describe gender ideology, where you have your your
brain, your heart,
and hearts and genetics. And you're you're supposed to pretend like there's no difference between males and females, but yet you can self-identify into either. And she had the audacity. Imagine somebody coming to talk to a room full of top-ranking sports officials, where we know that even like a 0.05% difference is the difference between a gold medal and not making the final, right? And she stood there and without batting an eye when I said, well, what do you do with, how do you explain the difference in world records? But she basically said that, well, it's only a 12% difference between males and females, so it shouldn't matter.
No big deal. It just means that there will be no more women's sports. But
her answer was that a 12% difference in, like, she's telling all of us who know that the impact and that the significance of 0.05%, and she stood there on behalf of the CCS telling us, well, there's only like 12% difference, so who cares? And we all just looked at, like, we couldn't believe how stupid she was. Like, we all looked at each other in this room like, are we even hearing this? And yet nobody in that room except me had the whatever audacity to even ask any questions about it. Like, and as soon as I started asking questions, guess what? The person who had brought her in to lecture us on the genderbread person, they quickly went to the front of the room, got her and said, well, she's got to go now. And they took her out right away.
There will be no questioning. There will be no questioning. You will accept this technology. I mean.
And in the coffee afterwards, everybody avoided me. And so I just thought, well, I went out, we were by the seaside. So I went out and just sat sort of outside a little bit, got my temper down a little bit. I wasn't very rude at all. I just asked a point blank question, just like I'm talking to you now. But I took a few deep breaths. And then, it was later in the evening, we had like the whole association had a big dinner. And I had people sneaking up to my dinner table telling me, thank you for saying this. We really appreciate what you said, but I can't let anybody know that I agree with you or I'll lose my job.
I can't tell you how many times people say that to me. That same thing. I'll get an email or they'll like call me or they'll tell me over Zoom meeting, I'm so thankful, but I can't say anything. And that is what is, I think, allowing this ideology to destroy women's sports, among many other things, because people do not have the strength of will and conviction to stand up and say, this is not okay, and risk the repercussions. I mean, I don't know if you've had any, but I know those of us in Partners for Ethical Care who are public, who are speaking out, have had some pretty tremendous ramifications for what we're doing. And
I'm sure you have. And
I hope you don't have any, but I
I will.
I suspect you will. And I'm so thankful that you are willing to stand up for this. It's so important. Your book is going to make such a big difference.
And I hope it even helps people in your struggle, because I think you're actually on a harder, really a lot tougher battle line, because really it's parents now who are really directly either insulted or elated that you're actually saying something about the children. The children's issue will come up, I think, more and more. Obviously, if more children are transitioning, then we're going to have a lot more involved with how do we, when they present themselves to the world of sports, then what are we going to do? And, that's why I felt it necessary within our association to establish biology-based rules unequivocally and very, very distinctly, so that nobody comes to us pretending or thinking they can actually change that rule, or at least, violate that rule.
Right.
And even if they're children, I'm sorry, but we have to have them compete in their biological sex. Now, if you're a little girl who's taking testosterone, then that's a different story. We're going to have to figure out that. But
and maybe you don't get to participate in competitive sports.
That's sometimes you hear no. Sometimes you just hear no.
Oh,
yeah. And that's gonna, but here's my point. See, fear makes you do bad things. So all the other sports associations who accept what the CCES is promoting, which is total self-ID, no surgery, no hormones. If you as a sport accept that as your premise, as your policy, then when it gets too hard, like when you're getting a lot of violations or unfair things, and then you try to change your policy, then it becomes a lawsuit.
Yes. Yeah, it's much harder to go back.
It's much harder. So if I would rather have a clear-cut policy up front and make them do the fighting and we would have to resist, but we have our charter, then bow and take a knee to the ideology, and then at some point realize, oh man, this was a mistake, and now we have to fight back in court because you've let so many people do it. And so that's what I saw instantly. I saw instantly that if we don't come on strong with what we establish as those parameters we're talking about in sport, it's like saying the football field doesn't have lines, and then all of a sudden everybody's everywhere. And then you say, oh, okay, now we're going to draw a line. The people who are left outside the line are going to get angry. Yeah. So what it seems to me, it's so much better. It's infinitely more protective to set up your boundaries early in this whole thing and hold that line so that you do minimize the amount of litigation.
And I actually feel like those boundaries are going to help children as well. If
that's the thing, we're protected.
If you have a girl who's athletic and she doesn't fit in with the other girls, she might be convinced she's transgender and start a testosterone. But if she knows she's not going to be allowed to compete, if she's on testosterone, she's far less likely to do that and damage her body. So those boundaries help in so many different ways. I'm so thankful that you're, establishing those and holding fast to them. And
thank you for reminding me that that's also going to be sort of a spillover, because I didn't, always think of it that way, but I think you're right. And in trying to protect our athletes, we're protecting everybody, because we have to have children understand that there is a yes and a no, and a no is very important to protect them.
And no isn't a bad thing. I mean, there's
No.
all kinds of reasons for no. And hurt feelings aren't
Yeah.
necessarily a bad thing. It's something that we need to learn to cope with.
Well,
So
that's the whole point in sports. You learn how to lose. You learn how, that's the point with women's sports, is that it's not a surprise that up to 80-90% of female executives in Fortune 500 companies all had sports in their background, because you learn how to win and lose.
Right.
You learn how to say, okay, you shrug it off. So somebody hurts your feelings, no big deal. Okay, let's move on. You learn how to just stand your ground, be responsible, and accept your losses when you don't do well, or accept their competition when you have to be better.
Yeah.
These are invaluable lessons.
About rules, following rules. And that's one of the things that I think is so important, is that this is such a breakdown of a fundamental rule that it sort of undermines the entire concept of sports, really. And
exactly.
So Linda, where can people get your book? I'm encouraging everybody to go out and buy one for themselves, one for their high school, one for their library, one for their next door neighbor. I mean, everybody needs to read this.
Yeah, it's called, you go to unsporting.com, unsporting.com.
And I can list that in the description below, so people can just link to it.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. That's the main website. And then there's a click if you want to buy it, or if you want to look at it some more. There's some other things there that describe the book. And actually, I'm having them now include the reference section for people to be able to click on the references easy on another page.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah, because it's kind of hard. Like when you're reading the book, all the references are at the end. And if you want to just go to the website and click on the link to whatever article, it's easier that way.
That's a really good idea. I'm going to actually suggest we do that with Maria Kepler's book.
Yeah, you should. Yeah, because I think it's hard for people to type in the URL.
Yeah.
And then I have these charts. I mean, they're all like the male versus female. They're all black and white in the book. But in the Kindle version, they're beautiful. Like, they're just beautiful charts. So, put in all your nice charts and diagrams too, like on that reference page.
Yeah, that sounds great. Is there anything else you want to say before we end?
Listen, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everybody, especially to my co-author, Barbara Kay, and Rebel News. Rebel News is my publisher. They're standing by me. They're not, there's people in Canada who would denigrate them, but they're the only ones. They're taking a chance on us and this book, and they're giving us the opportunity. So I want to say thank you. I was raised to say thank you. It's polite, and it's also they are being very heroic and taking the chance on this book, because they had to put out, to make it and to publish it. And so thank you to Rebel News. Thank you to Barbara Kay. And thank you to every one of the people like you, Erin, who are out there. I've met you on Twitter and in other platforms, who are just supporting it and promoting it, because, it was enough for me to just write it and get my heart into the papers, into the pages, my heart and mind, the things that I'm thinking about. But it'd be so much better if, out of all of this, the IOC could change and go back and suspend their policy. If they would do that one thing, it would cascade again and help the whole world of sport.
And I'm going to encourage everybody who's watching this to contact the IOC and their local sporting bodies. And NBC Network, who covers the Olympics. Oh, good idea. Okay. Yeah, tell them they don't appreciate a governing body in Olympic Games that allows male athletes into women's sports. I mean, we need to fight at that level, because they did. They went behind the scenes. Yeah. They went behind the scenes and instantiated these policies by stealth. And they suddenly appeared like, dandelions everywhere. Everywhere, in every walk of life, before we even knew what was happening. And we need to fight back at that level too.